It is a pleasure and a privilege to be speaking at the Freedom Summit today. These are indeed troubling times. Even the title of this event has become controversial. Our society is deeply divided. There is always an us and a them in society. Over the last year, we have seen those who don't want to get vaccinated against COVID, othered to become them. In the last month, those involved in the trucker convoy and those supporting them have become othered, to become them. You quickly see that those and them can be identified, othered, and not tolerated. What is amazing is how quickly and easily this happens. We naturally want to be us in society, not them. And that is the focus of what I want to talk about today. I have several roles, one of which is the executive editor of the International Journal for Religious Freedom. I am just about to publish a special issue on responding to secularism. I chose some artwork for the front cover depicting the city of Babylon burning. Biblically, Babylon represents the city that is turned away from God and fights against God. The artist, Grace Carol Bomer, has painted a series on Babylon depicting our secular society. What is amazing about the articles in this issue of the journal is the similarity of issues coming up in many places around the world: Latin America, Canada, Europe, and even Turkey. When the state and religion separated, it was to allow people in society to be able to get along and stop having wars over religion. What we have ended up with instead is secular intolerance. The state was supposed to be neutral towards all religions, but instead is trying to take over and push out religion. I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about what is happening in other parts of the world. We are not alone in dealing with secular intolerance. Then I will give you my thoughts on what we need to do in response. Let's start with Latin America. My stereotype of Latin America, and maybe yours too, is that it is a Roman Catholic region. I thought that in countries Mexico and South, Roman Catholic beliefs and traditions persisted, but that is not the case. Many countries in Latin America have adopted secular governments not influenced or tied to the Roman Catholic Church. The study in the journal focuses on Mexico and Colombia, but countries like Uruguay, Argentina, and Venezuela are similar. Only Brazil really has a strong Christian influence. Not that long ago, Protestant Christians, who were mainly Pentecostal, experienced intolerance, marginalization, and occasionally even violence at the hands of Roman Catholics in some Latin American countries. Now, even Roman Catholics experience intolerance at the hands of secularists. The narrative is that religion is private and cannot be talked about in public. This means that Christians cannot talk about their faith at work, or they may be ridiculed and excluded from being promoted. Christians' children are bullied at school if they talk about their faith. As is happening in Canada, there is tremendous social pressure against Christians who express religious beliefs about abortion, marriage, or sexual identity. Parents are discouraged from homeschooling their children and face social pressure if they do. As a result of all this social pressure, Christians self-censor. It is easier to go along to get along. Sound familiar? Don't talk about your faith. Don't post anything on social media. Keep quiet for the sake of your career and your family. Let's turn now to Europe. It is not a surprise that European countries, with a few exceptions, are secular and secularist. It is amazing to travel in Europe and see all the beautiful churches that are now historical artifacts. This is where wars were fought over religion. The Inquisition was held, and people were burned at the stake for what they believed. Now, people of faith are viewed with suspicion. They're oddities. Strangely, some European countries still have a state church. Yes, the Church of England, assuming that England is part of Europe, is a state church and state-funded. Countries like Belgium, Germany, and Sweden also have state churches. There is no compulsion for anyone in the country to join the church or participate in its activities. In Belgium, however, the state has sought to ensure that the church stays in its place under the law. Religious leaders have had to affirm that religion does not stand above the law. What does this mean? And why would the government make this a requirement? Well, why would the Canadian government require that organizations sign an attestation that they affirm the charter and will not violate it, even though the charter only applies to government, not to private institutions? But that's exactly what happened with applications for the Canada Summer Jobs Grant Program. It is an attempt to control religious institutions, to apply secular standards to religion. What does this mean for religious expression? It means that if religious institutions have different beliefs about certain issues than the state has, they should keep quiet about it. 20 years ago, Chief Justice Beverley McLachlin, then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, spoke at a conference on law and religion. She said that both law and religion are comprehensive doctrines, meaning that both have something to say about virtually all aspects of life. But, she said, don't worry, law will carve out space for religion and religious practices in Canada. The religious people at the conference were shocked. This was clearly a statement that law was above religion. She was saying that law is the comprehensive doctrine of Canada and religion is subordinate. Religion must appeal to the law to create space for it to exist, and the law determines what that space is. That is what it means for the state to require that religion affirm that it does not stand above the law. The implication is that it is not only subject to the law, but beneath the law. I want to be careful here because I recognize that Romans 13 affirms that Christians should be subject to the governing authorities. Churches and religious organizations are subject to government regulation, but the church and state are separate for the benefit of both. The state cannot tell the church what are acceptable religious beliefs and practices. This means that the state, or law, and religion need to stay in their lanes. Neither should try to control the other. That does not, however, mean that religious people, in our case Christians, are precluded from speaking on public policy matters, but we are far from being able to dictate to governments what they should do. But neither does the state control religious beliefs and practices. An example of how this plays out in practice is unfolding in Finland. A former cabinet minister, Pavi Räsänen, and Lutheran bishop Johanna Pohola were tried for the crime of ethnic agitation, similar to Canada's crime of hate speech. Dr. Räsänen, yes, she is a medical doctor as well as having been a politician, wrote a book about transgenderism that was published by the bishop. She took a Christian perspective on this issue as well as a medical perspective. The bishop runs a religious publishing house. Dr. Räsänen also tweeted a denunciation of the state church for supporting the gay pride parade and included a photo of an open Bible pointing to Romans 1:24-27. This kind of criminal charge is pretty shocking to Christians. But there was already a case in Sweden in 2005 where a pastor was convicted of a hate crime for a sermon on homosexuality. The conviction was overturned on appeal, but that the charges were even laid was a shock. In the current Finnish case, the concern is that quoting the Bible might be considered a criminal offense. This kind of case pits the coercive power of the state against the freedom of religion of a Christian and a Christian organization. You may be surprised to find out that we have had a similar case in Canada. It was not a criminal charge, but rather a complaint under the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code. Hugh Owens took out an ad in the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix in 1997 denouncing homosexuality. The ad included 4 Bible references, not the text, but just the references. A Human Rights Board of Inquiry found Mr. Owens contravened the Human Rights Code by publishing a newspaper advertisement which reflected his biblically based views about homosexuality. That result was upheld by the Court of Queen's Bench, but it was overturned on appeal to the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal. The court ruled that care must be taken when interpreting foundational sacred texts. We are expecting a ruling in the Finnish case at the end of March. Hopefully, the court will recognize the importance of religious people having the right to express religious beliefs in public about important issues, and that biblical texts are not expressions of ethnic agitation. However, I note that in the cases in Sweden and Saskatchewan, the trial level court ruled against the Christians. It was the appeal court that recognized the importance of religious free speech. It certainly puts a significant chill on religious free speech if there is a possibility of court action, particularly criminal charges, related to speaking a religious perspective on an issue. Our last stop in the international tour today is France. Some of you may be familiar with the French concept of laïcité. It was used as part of the argument for Bill 21 in Quebec, the law that prohibits Quebec government employees from wearing religious symbols like the hijab or a turban while at work. Laïcité means something similar to secularism, but is increasingly interpreted as excluding religion from public life. Last year, France passed a new law adopting laïcité as a French value. The new law casts suspicion on religion as a potential threat to the state. Given this potential threat, it is not surprising that the new law allows the government to have a high level of surveillance of religion. Houses of worship must register their buildings, and they can only be used for worship. And they must re-register every 5 years. There are reporting requirements for foreign donations. They must also agree to respect public order. All of this clearly casts religion in a negative light. We lived in France for a year and worshipped at an English-speaking church plant funded by Baptists in the US. I can tell you that because France is very secular, in fact, considered the most secular country in Europe, many foreign-funded missionaries are actively evangelizing there. They are not disturbing public order, but this new law puts them under scrutiny. There is debate as to whether what we're experiencing as Christians under secularism is persecution. One author in the journal refers to our experience as death by 1,000 cuts. To summarize the experience, policymakers, journalists, academics, and judges are now religiously illiterate. Secularization has been followed by implementation of progressive legislation as a result of identity politics. Identity politics influences public policy and court cases, but religion is not considered an identity. There's pressure on Christians to conform to cultural norms. There's discrimination against Christians, particularly street preachers, sometimes even including physical violence. The cumulative impact is a chilling effect on religious expression. So, what do we do? Well, when life hands you lemons, make lemonade. I don't mean to be flippant, but my point is to get beyond doom and gloom, to think about how we can make something good out of what seems to be very negative. I have spent my life working on unpopular Christian causes, and I continue to do so. So I can tell you from my own personal experience that I think the following ideas are doable. These are global issues, and we must work globally. These are issues for many people. We must work collaboratively across denominations and even across religions. Christians are fearful in our culture, so we must provide training in communicating our beliefs to the society we find ourselves in. Let's remember that the Christians were countercultural in the first century. They were known for feeding widows and orphans. They were known for radical love, and they weren't afraid of suffering, of trials, and even of persecution. We can only change the narrative by being gospel Christians, and that means bearers of the good news.